Hello and welcome to our second lecture of the spring 2021 semester for American History 131, Introduction to American History since 1877. And before we begin today's lecture, I want to speak briefly about something from the syllabus that I did not discuss in the first video lecture that you received via email recently. And that is concerning the textbook for this course. As it clearly states in the syllabus, the textbook for this class is American Yop. It is a free online textbook that's accessible at the website americanyop.com. That's YAWP, americanyop.com. It's a very well respected textbook, lots of prominent and well regarded historians have collaborated to produce the text. It's published by Stanford University Press, and it's very recent and up to date as well. When you go to the website, you can download free copies of Volume 1 and Volume 2 of American Yop. It's important to note that Volume 1 covers the first half of U.S. history. That's American history basically through 1877. And the second half covers American history from 1877 through the present. Obviously, Volume 2 will be what we are focusing on most during this course as the semester progresses. So those chapters 16 through 30, will be what you need to download and read. Also, Chapter 15, the final chapter of the first volume, that is where we are right now, as I felt that there was a need to discuss Reconstruction in full before we move on to the final quarter century of the 19th century and into the 20th century. So if you download and read Chapter 15 as the syllabus instructed last week, or catch up on it this week, whatever works for you, you can really get a sense of additional context and additional information to the lecture from this weekend, as well as this second lecture. But really, beginning Wednesday, we will be moving into territory that is in Volume 2 exclusively, chapters 16 through 30. And now that that is out of the way, let's pick up where we left off from the other day, and that is the end of Reconstruction and the results of Reconstruction. When I spoke to you in the first lecture, I discussed the Reconstruction Acts and what those acts were able to do for African Americans across the country, but especially in the South. I'm talking specifically about the 13th Amendment, which outlawed and abolished slavery, the Civil Rights Act of 1866, and the 14th Amendment, which basically protected the civil rights of African Americans in the U.S., and the 15th Amendment, which provided the franchise or the voting rights for African American men. African American men were able to vote in elections in the late 1860s, early 1870s, and as a result, we saw a dramatic rise in political participation among African American men in the U.S. That included men running for office, as 14 black men were elected to the U.S. House of Representatives during this time, but also at the local level with state and regional and county offices and things of that nature, as well as participating in political conventions, being delegates to state party conventions, for example, being delegates to perhaps the Republican National Convention as well. These were things that African American men could do as a result of the 15th Amendment. And taken together, these three Reconstruction era acts really provided a chance for upward mobility as far as politically and socially for African Americans post Civil War and into the years of Reconstruction. How do white Americans, particularly white Southerners, respond to an atmosphere where the African Americans now have newfound freedoms, newfound opportunities? And the answer is they rejected the laws that protected African Americans. Vigilante groups began to form. Most prominent and notable was the Ku Klux Klan, the original KKK, founded in Pulaski, Tennessee in the late 1860s and was active throughout the South across the 1870s. And groups like the KKK and the Night Riders and the White League targeted African American men to discourage them from political participation. Black men were threatened at the polls when they tried to vote, and black men and as well as black women and white men and women who were seen as supportive or aiding their African American counterparts in the region during this time were also targets of violence from vigilante groups. And there were some very violent acts that took place across the South during this time by these groups. Perhaps one of the most striking examples occurred in Colfax, Louisiana in the spring of 1873, where we have the Colfax Massacre. Just a little bit of detail with the Colfax Massacre. I won't go too in-depth into it, but basically there was a gubernatorial election in Louisiana taking place at the time as the governor's office was up for grabs. There were federal troops in the state from President Grant, sent there by President Grant to protect African Americans at the polls and basically patrol the polls. However, there was still the threat of violence, and in Colfax, a parish in Louisiana, which was located in a parish of Louisiana, which was nearly evenly split between black and white Southerners, there was a fear that the white Southerners might try to overtake the local government, and so a group of African American militia took control of the parish courthouse, I should say, just to ensure that order would hold, and that no shenanigans or illegalities would occur. When the white men of the parish found out about this, they were not happy, and a group of the Ku Klux Klan, along with the White League, another vigilante group, surrounded the courthouse. There was some shooting that took place, and as they attacked the courthouse, and the African American militia inside the courthouse fired back. At one point, the men inside the courthouse departed to have a ceasefire and perhaps even surrender, and at that point the whites opened fire on them and killed numerous African American men. The numbers have ranged anywhere from in the 60s to 120 or more. No historian really knows for sure, but that's an example of the types of violence that these vigilante groups would carry out if they had the opportunity. And they had the opportunity because local enforcement proved very difficult, even though there was federal troops In the South, most of those troops were sent to the major cities, and that left a large swath of rural communities, smaller towns, sparsely populated counties, where there might not be a federal troop contingent on hand to ensure that nothing got violent or out of hand. If you look at the picture to the right-hand side of this slide, you'll see the marker that denotes the site of the Colfax riot. We'll get into this a little bit later this week on Wednesday's lecture when we talk about the lost cause and how this era of the Civil War and Reconstruction was memorialized by white Southerners after Reconstruction, how they sort of reclaimed the narrative. As you can see by the picture, which was of the plaque, which was erected in the 1950s, it is clearly written by the white community leaders or somebody hired by the white leaders of the area, and they portray the event as a riot that was an uprising, and that the killings were justified. Most historians view it as a massacre, not a riot, and that it involved quite a bit of unjustified murder and homicide. So two different angles, two different narratives, and for many years in the South, from the late 19th century all the way through the late 20th century and even beyond, the white narrative plays out in terms of lionizing these men that were vigilantes in the post-Civil War era and were Confederates fighting against the United States military during the Civil War. So what is the goal of these white Southerners? They obviously want to prevent African Americans from exercising their right to vote and gaining political power and political office. But that's basically one part of trying to basically bring the South back to an antebellum social order. An antebellum is a word that means pre-Civil War, sort of that 50 to 60 year period in the first half of the 19th century, from roughly 1800 to 1855, 1860 or so, in which white supremacy ruled throughout the South, as African Americans living in the South were all enslaved and basically had no rights individually or as a group. And even though the South lost the war, many of the white Southerners, Southern Democrats politically at this time, refused to recognize the Reconstruction Acts and were trying through any way possible, whether it was through violent means, whether it was through other political means, to restore the South to the pre-Civil War era, the antebellum social order, I should say, in which whites were clearly above African Americans throughout the region. So let's talk now about the decline of Reconstruction, the waning years of Reconstruction in the early to mid 1870s. President Grant, that's Ulysses S. Grant, who was the Union hero in the Civil War, military hero, as the commanding general of the Union Army at the surrender at Appomattox Courthouse when the war was over. He was elected president in 1868 and re-elected to a second term in 1872. And Grant, in the face of this violence from in the South committed by the vigilante groups such as the KKK knew that there needed to be some sort of stronger military presence and legal legislation on the books to protect African Americans in the South and drastically reduce the KKK's influence and power. So from 1870 through 1872, Grant passed 3 laws that were designed to protect African Americans. 2 of these laws dealt directly with election security. One of them stated that federal marshals would be required to oversee polling places on election day to ensure that everybody, including the local African American men, could cast their votes without fear of violence being committed against them, and no intimidations or threats of any kind. Remember, at this time, women could not vote anywhere in the United States. Women would not get the franchise as a group until the early 1900s, in fact, actually post-World War I, in fact. So this is strictly men, white men and black men during this time who can vote, but Grant felt that federal marshals were necessary to ensure that blacks could vote safely. Another enforcement act created specific legal penalties for interfering in any citizen's vote. And the third law that makes up the enforcement acts officially designated the Ku Klux Klan as a terrorist organization and specifically outlawed the activities that Klansmen participated in as a group, gathering together in robes and burning crosses and riding through communities on horse to threaten and terrorize black men and women throughout the South. This law basically outlawed that. Unfortunately for the South as a region and for its African American residents in particular, these laws proved ineffective due to the resistance of local officials to enforce them. In order for laws to be effective that were passed by the federal government, there needs to be enforcement at the local level, and there was just simply not enough cooperation from the white community, particularly the white men who were in charge of law enforcement in the region to make these laws effective. As the 1870s roll on, we run into, or America, I should say, runs into a major financial crisis, and that is known as the Panic of 1873. And there were several reasons that contributing factors, I should say, that caused the panic and exacerbated the panic. But we'll start at the beginning. During the Civil War era, a decade or so before the Panic of 1873, Congress created greenbacks as the nation's first currency to be backed by the federal government. This was a popular initiative at the time. In the midst of the war itself, it spurred an increase in government spending and economic growth. But after the war ended, there was a gradual withdrawal of greenbacks from the Treasury Department, and railroads, which became big business after the war ended, began to overexpand, going into rural communities with small populations, and they just couldn't recoup the money that was needed to pay the interest on their loans. As a result, the railroad companies begin to default on their interest payments during the early months of 1873. At the same time that this is occurring, a financial crisis in Europe is leading investors over there to divest themselves, that is, sell of their American stocks and bonds that they had in American companies. That exacerbates the financial crisis, and it comes to a head in the early fall of 1873 when J. Cook and Company, one of the leading investment banks in America, declare bankruptcy. This leads to a depression that ultimately lasts 6 years, and at its peak, midway through that 6-year stretch in 1876, unemployment reached 14% in America. That was America's greatest financial crisis until the Great Depression of the 1930s, which we will discuss in much greater detail later in this semester. If you take a look at the upper right-hand corner of this slide, you'll see an editorial cartoon from the era, the Panic of 1873. The hairy-looking man with the broom there is supposed to represent the panic itself, and he is sweeping away the garbage, which includes these railroad companies that were defaulting on their loans and investment banking houses that went bankrupt and things like that. So a very popular editorial cartoon at the time to sort of signal what the nature of the crisis was, what the causes were, and how America felt. He's literally sweeping away the garbage in that cartoon there. So a little bit of artistic flourish to illustrate the point. So how does the Panic of 1873 and all of this economic anxiety affect politics and affect government during the era? It, quite frankly, really hurts President Grant and the Republican Party as a whole. Grant's administration was plagued with scandals throughout his second term in office, and many of those scandals involved corruption among cabinet members and other personal aides to Grant. These individuals, these men, I should say, all sought to profit off of their political positions and the power that came with holding those positions. They tried to use that to get for their own personal financial gain. It's important to note that Grant himself has never been directly tied or implicated into this corruption that occurred with these scandals, but it was basically many of his aides and cabinet officials and, frankly, friends. Grant was criticized for being perhaps too loyal to people that had helped him earlier in his life and career. He rewarded with positions of influence and power in his presidential administration, and some of them were unscrupulous and unethical, and that came back to bite Grant at this time. Really hurts him politically, hurts his public image nationally. At the same time, going back to the greenbacks that I just discussed just a few minutes ago, there's an argument over currency. Greenbacks had become a very popular currency or method of money for rank-and-file Americans to use as spending money during this era, because the federal government backed greenbacks. They backed the valuation of greenbacks. However, Grant personally opposed greenbacks. He favored the gold standard and gold as currency, and he wound up vetoing legislation that would have injected more greenbacks into circulation in the midst of these years of financial upheaval. And as a result, the scope of the financial crisis everything ranging from the high unemployment number to dissension over the currency, resulted in major political setbacks for Grant and the Republicans. The Republicans lost many congressional seats in the 1874 midterm elections, while Grant saw his dreams of running for and perhaps winning a third term as president fall by the wayside, as he ultimately would not run, hurt by the scandals and by the reduced power of the Republican Party, his party, nationally after the 1874 midterm elections. One more thing to note during this time as far as political fallout, in 1873, the Supreme Court ruled in the slaughterhouse cases that the 14th Amendment did not transfer control of civil rights from states to the federal government. It was basically a case in which several slaughterhouses sued the federal government, over the 14th Amendment and civil rights protections, arguing that the federal government had total control and that should be, at least some of it should go to the states and not the centralized federal government. This ruling really weakens the effect of the 14th Amendment because it gives more power to the states in matters of civil rights, and that directly impacts recently emancipated black Southerners, as now all of a sudden their civil rights hinge on state politics and state governments rather than federal governments. In the South, the state governments were beginning to be reclaimed by Southern Democrats during this time period at this local and state level. So, now we move on to the election of 1876, the next presidential election. I mentioned earlier that Grant was not going to run for re-election in part because of his image declining in the wake of his scandals and the financial crisis. So with no incumbent, it was an open race, and two governors wound up running against each other. Samuel J. Tilden was the Democratic candidate, governor of New York. Rutherford B. Hayes, the Republican governor of Ohio, ran against Tilden. And if you look in the upper right-hand corner of the slide, you'll see pictures of the two candidates. And on the left side, the bearded man is Rutherford B. Hayes, and to his right, the clean-shaven candidate is Samuel J. Tilden. Hayes and Tilden and the two parties didn't really disagree too much on significant policy issues, so that meant that the campaign wound up devolving into mudslinging, as the Republicans and Democrats basically argued about scandals and perceived slights and things of that nature. The Democrats accused the Republicans of being tied to their president at the time, Grant, and his scandal-plagued administration, while the Republicans blamed the Southern Democrats for seceding from the Union and starting the Civil War back in 1861. So even though the Civil War had been over for a decade at the time that this campaign took place, it was still fair game, at least in the minds of Republicans, to bring up and hold against the Democratic Party, particularly the Southern Democrats that were the driving members of secession back in the early 1860s. How did the race turn out? Well, Samuel J. Tilden, the Democratic candidate, wound up winning the popular vote, and he received 184 electoral votes at that time, one shy of the necessary 185 votes to win the Electoral College and win the presidency. Rutherford B. Hayes, on the other hand, received 165 electoral votes. 3 states, Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina, did not certify their votes. There was significant dispute from Republicans and Democrats at the local level over voting and which ballots should be counted and the outcome of the election in those 3 states. In addition, Republicans also claimed that one of Oregon's 3 electoral votes should be awarded to Hayes, even though Tilden carried the state of Oregon in that election. So, who becomes president? Well, in order to resolve the dispute, Republican Party struck a deal with the Southern Democrats in February of 1877. This is known as the Compromise of 1877, and it basically consists of 3 major requests or demands, if you want to put it that way, on the Southern Democrats asking of the Republicans. First, the Southern Democrats wanted Hayes to agree to withdraw the remaining federal troops out of the South. The second stipulation that they requested was for Hayes to appoint a Southern Democrat to a cabinet-level position in his administration. And finally, they wanted Hayes to endorse construction of a transcontinental railroad through the South. Railroads were beginning to be built and change the transportation and business and economic landscape and fortunes of the nation during this time. The South also was reeling not only from the Panic of 1873, but the fact that so much of Southern business before the Civil War was agricultural and dependent on slave labor. They don't have slave labor, and quite a bit of the land had been destroyed in the war. So there were still plenty of Southern farmers and African American sharecroppers as well during this time. But the overall position of farming and agriculture in the South at this time versus where it had been in the late 1850s, the dawn of the 1860s, before the war, was almost a night and day difference there. So these Southern Democrats wanted a transcontinental railroad to be built through the South to bring business and jobs and economic growth to the South. Hayes and the Republicans agreed to these stipulations from the Southern Democrats, and the Compromise of 1877 is consummated. Hayes becomes president as he winds up getting the 19 votes from those electoral votes from those 3 southern states that I mentioned, Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina, plus the Oregon vote, and he winds up winning the Electoral College vote over Tilden 185 to 184, narrowly claiming the presidency in 1876 and early 1877. I mentioned earlier that Tilden won the popular vote quite handily during this campaign. So what happens as a result of this compromise beyond Hayes ascending to the White House? The first thing that happens is the remaining Republican state governments in the South collapse, and Southern Democrats take control of those state legislatures and governor's offices and all kinds of local positions of power and influence politically. The group that took control, the specific group of Southern Democrats, were known as the Redeemers, and they began winning elections at the state and local level in the early 1870s, as early as 1871. But they finished the job, if you will, in 1877 with this compromise, as they, at that point, basically had total control over the state and local offices throughout the southern states. And many of these redeemers were men who were veterans of the Confederate Army or had supported the Confederacy during the Civil War, either politically or financially or a mixture of the two. And what do these men want? They want the same thing that the vigilante groups, the KKK and the White League and the Night Riders that I mentioned earlier in today's lecture wanted. They wanted to reverse gains made by African Americans as a result of Reconstruction Acts and enforcement acts. They wanted to return the South to the social and political order of the antebellum period. Hence the name Redeemers. They wanted to redeem the South to its former glory as a region, and the key to that, in their minds, was to reinstate white supremacy throughout the South and ensure that white people were at the top of the political, economic, and social order throughout the region going forward as in the later years and decades of the 19th century. It was very much a difficult time for the South's African American citizens, especially for the black men that had become politically active during the first half a dozen or more years of Reconstruction. As one former slave succinctly summarized the results of this turnover in local governments, he said, "The whole South, every state in the South has got back into the hands of the very men that held us as slaves." So that is the results of Reconstruction. We will talk a little bit more about that later this week, and next week we'll talk about how the Redeemers went about creating Jim Crow segregation with new laws and new state constitutions, and also how the historical narrative of the South changed with the Redeemer government and with citizens in civic groups that wanted to extol the virtues of Confederate soldiers and the Confederate dead, and extol the virtues of white supremacy. This is known as the Lost Cause, and it begins in the 1880s and continues throughout the early decades of the 20th century. We will talk more about the Lost Cause and its effects on Wednesday, but we will also on Wednesday get into a discussion about America's westward expansion and everything that entailed for a variety of groups, individuals, groups, as manifest destiny, the idea of expanding all the way coast to coast and having the nation span the entire continent was the goal at the time, and we will delve into that in great detail on Wednesday and Friday of this week. Until then, I say so long. Have a great start to this week and this first full week of the spring semester. Hope everything is going well for each and every one of you in all of your classes, and I look forward to speaking to you again on Wednesday.